Okay, so you don't have to cite everything you have on a topic. Just pick the best examples, I guess, like maybe, 3 or 4 of the best examples of what you are stating. So, continuing on, make sure that whatever organization you choose for your paper, obviously you're going to have headings in a certain order, but within those sections, obviously, you're going to want to make sure that the organization of your paragraphs and of your sentences within those paragraphs is not accidental, not just whatever order things happen to occur to you, but purposeful, that you chose that organization because it was the most logical. And this is going to require being willing to experiment a little bit and move things around. And if you're afraid that you're going to forget how you had it in your first draft, then just save a master copy and then open up a couple of blank documents and copy paste your whole manuscript, and then those can be your experimental drafts. Now make sure, like we said before, that in your findings/results section that you're organizing yourself by finding, theme by theme, not study by study. So again, you don't want to start a paragraph with an author's name. That's kind of a good way to make sure that you're not doing that study by study summary. You're instead going to want to make sure that every paragraph begins with a topic sentence that states the take-home message, the main idea, whatever that finding is. And again, it's not study by study because there might be 5 or 6 studies that all have the same finding. So whatever that finding is what you're going to start with, and then you can pick out salient details from some of the best examples of the studies that support that finding and give, a little bit more texture and detail. But you do not need an exhaustive, detailed summary of every single study that you review. That's not really what we're doing in a literature review. So, tips for the background section. We're just going to go section by section. Background is your first impression, and you might want to consider a popular structure for introductions, which is what we call "Wake Up, This Concerns You." And so that means that you're going to open with important, attention-grabbing information that shows why your paper is necessary and why it's important. So why should we care about this, essentially? So something that really hits home, some startling statistic about the prevalence or seriousness of the issue, for example. You're going to want to show us why we should care. You want to make sure in your background section that you're using plenty of source material, plenty of statistics, plenty of examples. Who else believes that this problem is significant? It's not just you, obviously. So what all has been said about this, and what evidence do we have that this is a significant issue? And also think about what foundational fundamentals do your readers need to know and understand about your topic in order to understand the rest of the paper. So you're going to want to clarify things for readers outside your specialty. And when I say outside your specialty, obviously if you're a nurse and you're writing a lit review, your audience is most likely other nurses. But that doesn't mean that every nurse has your same exact body of information. So if you, for example, are a cardiac nurse, a nurse in a different specialty like a psych nurse or a nurse even in acute care or something like that, they're not necessarily going to know everything that a cardiac nurse knows, and yet your lit review might be useful to them. So clarify things for people who might not have your exact same specialized knowledge. You want to end your background section with a clear, concise purpose statement. Now, this doesn't have to fit into one sentence. It can be as long sometimes as a paragraph, but it should include your guiding question or questions, your research question. And you don't have to phrase it as a question necessarily. You can say, here's what we set out to learn, but it should be very specific and very clear and let the reader know exactly what it was that you wanted to learn about in your literature review. And a lit review's purpose isn't to prove a point. It's not to prove a hypothesis, because going down that road can be dangerous in that it can lead you to bias. So you're not setting out to prove that you were right about something. When we go at it with that mindset, we might be tempted to leave out studies that don't support our hypothesis, for example, and that's not what we want to do. We want to be comprehensive and present the true picture of what we know about this topic at the moment. Some things might not support that, okay, and that's fine. That's interesting. We need to explore that. Why might that be? That might lead us to future research. So it all has to be included. So instead, it's a good idea to just simply say, here's what we wanted to learn. Here is the question or questions we set out with. And then whatever the results are, that's what the results are, and we deal with them. Now, moving on to the methods section. It might not be possible to review all the literature on your topic. Sometimes we will put in our search terms and we end up with way more articles than we could possibly manage in one paper. So when that happens, we have to narrow down our results based on thoughtful inclusion and exclusion criteria. Whatever those may be, you want to make sure you're sharing those with your readers so that they understand how you arrived at the studies that you arrived at and what exactly the topic is that you're looking at. So ignore that note there at the bottom. Again, this presentation was originally for a course I was teaching, so obviously you're not going to have access to that sample paper, but whatever your inclusion and exclusion criteria are, you're going to share them in your methods section. So moving on to your findings section, or sometimes called the results section, this is where we are presenting the synthesis of the evidence. So to synthesize, we've talked a little bit about it already. Essentially, this is where we're thinking about how ideas relate to each other. So do we have studies that agree with each other? Do we have studies that disagree with each other? Do we have studies that agree with each other, but some of them present some additional information or a slightly different angle on the subject matter? The idea is to uncover the big picture, the bird's eye view, the most important ideas that emerge from the body of evidence. So again, it's the body of evidence, the take-home messages from that, not exactly what we learned study by study by study. You're not giving exhaustive detail about every individual study in your findings section. So this is crucial in order to A, avoid being redundant and repeating ourselves, and B, to avoid sounding like a book report. So synthesizing the evidence can help us identify evidence to support practice change. It can help us identify gaps in the evidence that suggest topics for further research, where more study is needed before we can use findings in practice. So areas where we maybe are starting to get an idea of what the evidence says, but we need a little bit more clarification on 1 or 2 points before we can really make a practice change. Now the next 4 slides are from that wonderful Walden University Writing Center presentation on literature reviews. And you can easily find that if you just Google Walden University Writing Center Literature Reviews, and it'll come right up for you. It's a terrific presentation. Here is an example of summary versus synthesis. So summary is a brief description of one source's main ideas. It tells a story of each individual source, and as I said earlier, it's what we're doing in an annotated bibliography. And it has its place. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. It's just not what we're doing in a lit review. Synthesis is an extended explanation of ideas, trends, themes, theories, and or methods among multiple sources. So again, think of it like a bird's eye view of the whole body of evidence. Synthesis combines multiple sources to tell a detailed story of the topic, and it's what we're doing in a lit review. So here's some examples of what synthesis looks like in a paper. Schwester reported results consistent with findings in Hills and Yao studies. So we're showing here how we've got multiple studies that agree with each other. Keller found that X occurred. Likewise, Dahl found that X occurred, but also noted that the effects of X differed from those suggested by Keller. So now we've got a situation where we have 2 studies that found some of the same stuff, but then maybe had a little bit of a difference of opinion on how that works or why that is, and that's perfectly fine. Again, that's synthesis. We're telling about what a conversation between those 2 authors would look like. Although Mahmoud suggested X, O'Donnell recommended a different approach. So here's what we do when we have contradictory findings or studies that disagree with each other. That's important too. And it's important to sometimes examine, why might those contradictions be there? Especially like if you have a situation where, let's say you've got 12 articles and 11 of them all say X, but then the 12th one is an outlier and says something completely different. That can be really interesting to explore as well. What made that one study different? Here are some common errors when people write literature reviews. I'm sorry, I keep scratching my nose. I've got a cat hair, I think, in there. So anyway, errors that occur quite a bit in literature reviews is where we are presenting multiple sources without clear connections. So what we would call citations, an example of that in a moment, where we're trying to force illogical relationships among sources or among ideas. So statements like, most researchers agree, or these statistics are alarming, or study X is just like study Y, where it's a little bit too generalized and a little bit too broad of a statement. Using back-to-back direct quotations, bad idea as well. You want to use quotations sparingly in academic writing. You're not going to use a lot of them. And if you want a rule of thumb, I would say no more than one per page, but I'd say even that is a bit much. You want to focus instead on paraphrasing and summarizing instead, remembering, of course, that even when you're paraphrasing and summarizing, you still have to cite your source, because we cite whether we're using another author's exact words or whether we're using their ideas. Synthesis, on the other hand, is where we're presenting clear relationships among sources. We're establishing logical connections among sources. So, for example, author X's results aligned with author Y's in these ways, and then we would elaborate on that. And where we're, instead of quoting, we're paraphrasing, and then we're analyzing that source material. So we're not just sticking one quote after another. We're not just plunking down the information from the source, but then we're commenting on it. We are integrating it. We're explaining how it relates to our main idea. So it really requires you to engage with your sources. And I think this is a good visual aid to kind of help you understand what we're saying about synthesis. In a lit review, what you read and what you write are like an iceberg. What you write is just the tip of the iceberg. So again, we're not doing an exhaustive description of every single study. We're given our bird's eye view and just that little tippy top of the iceberg. What you've read is much, much more detailed, and much more information is what you don't see under the surface. So a lot more goes into a lit review than the reader will actually see. And if that bothers you and you want the reader to have access to all that detail, then that's what the evidence table is for. And you will see a lot of literature reviews published with their evidence tables, so that if the reader wants to look at all the detail about every individual study, they can do that in the evidence table. So remember that, especially if you're using a visual aid of any kind, you need to remember that the whole point of the visual aid is to summarize and to sum up and to give information so that you don't have to put that in the text. So when multiple studies address the same thing, you're not going to write a separate paragraph on each one. Instead, you're going to organize those ideas together. So for example, the demand for registered nurses continues to exceed the supply, and this problem will worsen as more nurses retire in upcoming years. And see, we've got a number of different sources cited there at the end of that sentence, so we know that all of those studies supported that finding. This is a particular problem in hospitals where most new graduates work. And again, we've got multiple sources cited for that one. Many factors affect the demand for RNs, including the aging population, acuity of patients in hospitals, shortened hospital length of stay, and new technologies for care. But when findings differ, you should also report those separately to avoid confusion. So when we have contradictions, we want to indicate that as well. So original might be, previous studies have shown a return rate of surveys ranging from 25 to 65% after clinic staff sent postcards reminding patients to send back their surveys. And now we've got two sources cited there. Now the problem with that sentence is that we can't tell which percentage goes with which study. So we don't know if that 25% goes to Adams or to Gabau. So the way we would fix that is we would cite the relevant study right after the relevant piece of information. So after 25% we've got Adams, and after 65 we've got Gabau, and now we can tell which is which. So it clarifies things for the reader. Now some people aren't aware that you can do that in APA style, but you absolutely can, and in fact you should.